If you recall, a while back I covered a collection of games that were heavily inspired by Twisted Metal, and if they weren't heavily inspired, it certainly felt like they were. Now, I've more or less covered all the games I wanted to. I never intended to cover the entire genre, but when the video was released, I was met with a bunch of suggestions for other Twisted Metal-like games I could cover. So I thought, you know what, if we can pull together another 10, why not make part 2? I should admit, there's going to be some big requests that will not be on this list. This is a list specifically about car combat games. I can't have racing games with combat elements. Carmageddon was a massive request, but Carmageddon is undisputedly its own thing. Same for Jack X Racing, or Hot Wheels Velocity X. So if you don't see something you suggested, chances are it didn't quite fit. Of course I'm willing to stretch if I need to, but only if I need to. Also, I will not be touching multiplayer only games, even if they completely fit the bill. And before we get started, I just wanted to clarify that when I use the term knockoff, I don't mean it in a negative way. I use the term knockoff as a catch-all word to succinctly communicate the sentiment thing that is heavily inspired by another thing. It might give the wrong impression, but it's also the most appropriate word to communicate the mission statement of the video without being too wordy, so keep in mind I don't intend knockoff in a negative way. Finally, this will be by no means a thorough review of any of these games, just a quick impressions from a first-time playthrough. So, with that, let's get started on part 2 of this sumbitch. So this is a game that was recommended to me by the good people of the comments section. I'd never heard of Battletanx, but it apparently had a decent profile back in the day. It was made by the 3DO company, and I looked it up, and this is indeed the company that was responsible for the 3DO, which I know should be obvious, but I always heard it referred to as the Panasonic 3DO, but Panasonic was just the manufacturer. But after the console failed, they pulled a Sega and went to software development. Now, when I looked this game up, I didn't realize at first that Battletanx and Battletanx Global Assault were separate games. I don't mean this as the insult that it sounds like, but Battletanx has such generic presentation that I couldn't even tell the difference from a first glance. But sure enough, there is a difference, and sure enough, the generic presentation doesn't do justice to the absolute bonkers places these games go, and I was not prepared for it. So here's the sitch. In 2001, a deadly virus called X2 suddenly sweeps the world and for reasons that will be explained in the sequel, targets almost exclusively women. So women start to be rounded up and taken to quarantine zones for their safety. Men the world over flip out over this. Fucking white knights. Forcing the military to use deadly force. However, some army officials disagree with the choices made and defect, sparking a civil war. Then, because various countries realize that the country with the most women is the one most likely to thrive in the future, they start nosing in on each other's quarantine zones, which sparks an aggressive nuclear war. That escalated quickly. Meanwhile, our protagonist, Griffin Spade, just got engaged to his girlfriend Madison. However, she decides to turn herself into the government for both their safety. Then friggin' New York gets nuked. So when it's all said and done, most of the world's population is dead, and females now only make up 0.1% of the population, meaning we face potential extinction. And apparently without women to be our moral compasses, men collectively decided to embrace their primal rage, meaning the world is a wasteland with roaming gangs of murderers. And our boy Griffin decides to man a tank and rescue his fiancée, and that final line is surprisingly profound. When there is nothing left to live for, what would you die for? For a game about shooting people in tanks, that is ridiculously heavy. I find the over-the-top melodrama to be equal parts compelling and silly, and I do appreciate that they put a good amount of effort into the narrative when they really didn't need to. Still, I think they tried a little bit too hard, and they tried to fit far too much into far too little of a space, so some things leave me scratching my head. Why did we go straight to nuclear war being my biggest question? Still, I appreciate the effort, and I like that they go above and beyond as far as what they needed to do for a framing device. And just as a side note, threats of nuclear war, a pandemic, national protests ending with deadly force? You'd think the 3DO company could have stayed in business if they could tell the future like this, but you won't be thinking about any of that while you're playing the game, which is pretty good. I think this game is like Twisted Metal insofar as you're in vehicles blowing people up. But tank-based games have existed almost as long as video games have existed, but we'll roll with it. As you play the game, you find yourself in various locations as you cross the United States, and you have to complete various objectives. You may need to blow up the enemy tanks, you may need to get to the end of the map, or you may need to rescue what's called Queen Lords, which is how they refer to the few remaining women. God, between the entire world going to shit because there aren't enough women and the remaining women being referred to as queens, this entire game really is just the neckbeard nice guy manifesto. The different objectives from level to level and the relatively short campaign means the game stays relatively fresh and the gameplay itself is simple and intuitive, which also adds a little bit of replayability despite the game only having one campaign. The controls, on the other hand, need some work, because you have several control options and none of them are optimal. The ideal control scheme for a tank-based game would be something like Shell Shock on PS1, where you have to independently move the barrel and the tank itself, so you can aim and avoid enemy fire, but none of these control schemes give you that option. You can strafe, but that just means you can move forward or back while independently aiming. You can't move out of the way of obstacles because you can't turn while strafing. The C buttons aren't used for the standard gameplay for my preferred control setup, so they would be perfect for rotating the barrel. I also wish there was a way to have a specifically designated accelerate button while also having analog steering, because neither maneuvering with the C buttons or maneuvering with the thumbstick is optimal. You either don't get analog movement, or steering and movement is done using the same input, which means you can't optimally prioritize one or the other. For example, you can't turn while going full speed because to go full speed you need to be holding the analog stick all the way forward, but if you're holding it forward you also can't turn left or right. Otherwise, I think this game is self-explanatory. There's really not much to say. You go from level to level, you shoot shit, and you get shot at you. You got plenty of weapons you can use, which adds some spice to the moment-to-moment gameplay. The action is non-stop and satisfying. The combat has a real impact to it, and thankfully the ammo is limited but not scarce, so you can go buck nutty with the shots without being afraid of running out. Turning this into a quick draw simulator, where it's all about how you maneuver around the enemies and how you aim. The combat is explosive both figuratively and literally, and blowing enemies to Kingdom Come with a variety of explosives never loses its luster. One thing I really appreciate is the destructible environments. Obviously it's very primitive, but in a game primarily based around tanks, the ability to destroy pretty well everything around you is a welcomed feature that makes every environment feel that much more alive, and fits the gameplay perfectly. Pickups also primarily come from destroyed buildings, so it's thankfully also not done just for its own sake. I will say though, one thing that harms the game is the performance. This game is maybe a little bit too ambitious, so you have big environments with lots of enemies, which causes a lot of slowdown. Even using the nuke weapon, which is one of the first weapons you can get in the game, damn near makes your N64 explode. I know game performance wasn't as important to developers back then, but if performance starts being measured in seconds per frame and not frames per second, maybe tone it down a bit. I will admit though, I am emulating this, so that may have altered the performance slightly. Also, the game does take a bit of a dip in quality in the back half. At first you have a fairly good balance of level types, but towards the end of the game almost every level is about rescuing Queen Lords, which gets pretty tedious. And also, I found the difficulty ramps up a bit too quickly. I built up an impressive amount of lives in the first half of the game, mostly because I found bum rushing levels, especially the Queen Lord levels, was easy and you get a hell of a lot of points for the time bonus. Plus, you can grab stars from downed enemies which heals you. But then from around the Area 51 level onward, it becomes pretty hectic, and the last couple levels are hell in this regard, so ramping things up more steadily would have been nice. I also found that I got caught up in the environments a little bit more often than I would have liked. Narrow passages were the bane of my existence. Plus, the game can't help but end on a bit of a damp squib. You rescue Madison and the game just ends. I guess it makes sense because the only real antagonist was getting across the country, but with no antagonist, there's no final boss, so it just ends. But still, I rather enjoyed my time with this game, and I would love to go back and work on beating my times and getting through the Golden Gate Bridge level without losing half my lives. It's a solid old-school tank simulator with a stimulating gameplay loop, a simple goal worth getting behind, and a hell of a dramatic story. And now for part 2 of this trilogy, Battletanx Global Assault. I'm playing on PS1 this time, mostly for those wonderful FMVs. I would just like to say, I am thankful there are 2 Battletanx games because I was really scraping the bottom of the barrel to fill up this list, so I was genuinely considering covering something like Cell Damage HD. From what I understand, the only major difference is the introduction of a health bar, but that's just how desperate I was. So thank you Battletanx Global Assault, you disappointing sequel you. Okay. Disappointing is maybe a bit of a stretch, but it's more like 2 steps forward, 2.5 steps back. 5 years after the events of the first game, Griffin and his armies have established a new government, and he's living peacefully in San Francisco with his wife and kid until a Queen Lord named Cassandra sacks San Francisco and later kidnaps Griffin's son. So Griffin and his wife have to go on a journey across the United States and eventually across Europe to track down Cassandra, rescue their son, and find out the truth behind the X2 virus. Spoilers, Cassandra did it. It's less melodramatic than the first game, mostly because once you break out nuclear war as a plot device, there's really no way to top that. But where last time they were too melodramatic, this time the story gets really absurd by the end, with weird sci-fi elements being introduced with things like eugenics and something called edge powers, apropos of what feels like nothing. It just felt like they were trying to escalate the stakes, but it felt really weirdly out of place and laughably contrived. This is a 5-year-old's idea of raising the stakes, specifically a 5-year-old that understands that stories need escalation but doesn't understand the concept of tone or consistency. It's the problem of taking a story that was relatively grounded and straightforward and attempting to build a larger mythology out of it. And it does get a little bit frustrating having to constantly be chasing Cassandra only for her to get away for the upteenth time, but I'm willing to roll with it. It still goes above and beyond for what it is, and while not nearly as dramatic, still has enough personality that I can dig it well enough. It's funny how this is called Global Assault, but you spend most of the game in the States and only go to a handful of places in Europe. If you're gonna pull a Twisted Metal 2 and make an isolated plot an international thing, commit to it. Let's do some tank fighting on the North Pole, or Tokyo, or Dubai. Have some fun with it. The game is largely the same, although since I'm playing on PS1, the graphics are quite different, but there are a few significant changes. The most major addition is how they updated the lives system. Instead of having lives in the traditional sense, you get what's called tank bucks. You'll find them scattered throughout some of the levels and have to spend some tank bucks to be able to respawn. And if you run out of tank bucks, game over. It's an interesting idea, but I'm not so sure about it. It creates a situation where you're basically forced to demolish every level to find every bit of pocket change you can, which adds a bit of a tedious checklist element to every level. And tank bucks get scarcer and the levels get harder as the game goes on, which means the difficulty ramps up just a little bit too steep compared to if you just had a traditional live system. It's a neat little experiment that didn't quite work out, but I can dig it. I think with some tweaking, this could have been great. Balance it better and maybe add some optional objectives for more tank bucks? Run with it. But I like the idea, and the execution isn't bad, maybe just a little bit mishandled. Each level will have a different selection of tanks you can play as, and they each have a different cost, so you can get by on the bare minimum if you're good enough, or you can choose to roam around in an expensive, but aggressively powerful tank. It's a good system for risk-reward. In theory. I almost never used anything but the standard tank or some equivalency. A lot of these tanks you can use are only situationally useful, like the one that shoots mortars. Unless this is a situation where I have to shoot over a wall, having a weapon that goes up and down isn't very useful, especially if it doesn't explode on impact. And besides, I already have secondary weapons to choose from anyway. But situationally useful is at least useful in some regard, and I got use out of most of these tanks at some point, so clearly they're doing something right. Otherwise, yeah, it's pretty much the same game as before. They have some new enemy types to spice things up and all of one new level type. You still have kill all the enemies, get to a place, rescue the thoughts, which is also broken up into subdivisions of that level type where you have to collect things such as data discs as well, but you also have levels where you destroy all the things. Which is such a no-brainer that I'm surprised they didn't put this in the first game, but I guess there was no antagonistic force in the first game beyond the prospect of not making it across the country, so now you have someone to fight against, and therefore something that's working against you, so it makes some level of sense to have such things like missiles courtesy of the antagonist to contend with. If it seems like I'm stretching, it's because I really don't have much to say about this game. Like the first game, it's self-explanatory, but this game is more of the same with some added bits, so it's basically good. It lacks the freshness of the first game, but it's still an enjoyable enough time while you're playing it, and not all of its ideas hit, but it still works as a full package. Well, it worked as a full package at first. What really kills this game for me is that it overstays its welcome. The first game can be beaten in an hour or so. This game took me 4 hours to beat, which doesn't sound like much, but the gameplay is so limited that it's much better served for a short running time. This game wears thin after like 2 hours, let alone 4. What would help is shortening the levels where you have to destroy all the tanks, because a lot of those felt like they go on forever with never-ending waves of enemies spawning. If you at least sped up their spawn rate, that would be great, because I felt like much of my time in those levels were spent waiting. But even then, there's no reason you have to fight as many enemies as you do, it's just pointless padding. Either way, I was enjoying Global Assault at first, but I was just begging for it to end after a while, and every time I thought it was about to end, it just kept going. Now, I referred to this as a trilogy earlier, and I'm sure there's already somebody correcting me in the comment section. To clarify, this was intended to be a trilogy, but the third game was never made. Global Assault ends on a cliffhanger, but 3DO Company went out of business before one could be made, so this is just another case of a piece of media tempting fate. To those who are fans of the franchise, I sympathize. Then again, that just goes to show why cliffhangers are such a counterintuitive thing to do. But that's just me. Word to the wise, the mere existence of a cliffhanger does not guarantee a sequel. Dead in the Water on PS1 was a very big request, and I can see why. Many described it as twisted metal with boats, and that it certainly is. I'm not kidding, right down to it being a competition that takes place once a year, and you have several different colorful characters you can choose from that each have their own bio, ending, and even character-specific special attack. You could tell me this exists in the Twisted Metal universe and I'd believe you, but honestly, thank you to the people who recommended this to me because Dead in the Water is hype as fuck. Mostly. Now, you have two modes, racing and battle. The racing feels like it was added as a bit of an afterthought to make this game seem like it wasn't overtly inspired by Twisted Metal, but that's an uphill battle because it blatantly is. It's at least a decent addition once you get tired of the main mode. I've always thought you could be a good car combat game or a good combat racer. This game tries to do both, and as such, the racing feels a little bit tacked on. Meanwhile, the combat mode is basically awesome, minus one specific flaw that I'll get into in a bit. That said, both modes function the same as far as progression. You get points depending on where you place in the level rankings, and if you get enough points, you qualify for the next season of competition. Consider it like a tournament mode in a kart racer. Now, because this game is based around boat combat, the controls are quite slippy-slidey. It's neither a positive nor a negative aspect in itself, it's just kind of a reality of the game. I do appreciate that they go for somewhat realistic boat physics, but it does take some getting used to. Mastering the drift is probably the easiest way to succeed in this game, because it's by far the quickest way to maneuver around tight spaces. The floatiness makes the movement feel a bit chaotic, but that just comes with the territory. Then once again, not having a dedicated accelerate button is a continuing theme with these games. The X button in this game is specifically used for your special weapon, but I don't see a reason why they couldn't have the special be part of the weapon wheel you scroll through. Twisted Metal does this. Then you could use the X button for accelerate, but then again, you use the machine gun with triangle, you drift with square, and you fire your selected weapon with circle. So those are three buttons you're going to be using the most, especially holding down the triangle button because your machine guns never overheat. So having to separate that by making X accelerate might make it hard because you would need to press all four of the face buttons at any given moment. I guess given what this game is trying to go for, the controls are about as good as you could hope for, but man, it's just crying out for another button or two to better balance the controls. It hinders the racing mode more than any. Not having an accelerate button in a vehicle combat game is like not having iron sight aiming in a first-person shooter. You can get by without it, but it f***ing helps. But not having a specifically designated accelerate button in a racing game or game mode is like not having a jump button in a platformer. It's a crucial element that's missing. Dead in the Water is trying to keep a lot of balls in the air, and I really appreciate just how ambitious it is. And despite my complaints, it really works out. The action is fast and fluid, the levels and level design is varied and intricate with lots to explore and have fun with while you're blowing everyone to Kingdom Come. The different boats add a different flavor to each playthrough, and I like how the water physics adds to gameplay. Sometimes I forget what the PS1 is actually capable of, so having a proper physical response to waves is impressive. Most weapons, especially the powerful ones, will create massive waves, and there's one weapon in particular, the shockwave, that will cause a massive rippling wave that will launch you into the sky. It's mundane, but I find it both impressive and a unique addition to the tactical elements of the game compared to its contemporaries. Although to be quite frank, beyond the novelty, that weapon is probably the most useless weapon in the entire game, as it doesn't really do anything beyond launch people, so I usually only use them because I had to, not for any strategic reasons. The other weapons as usual vary in terms of usefulness, but some of them pack a serious wallop that makes them really fun to use. I found the most reliable way to take your opponents apart is to get a bunch of regular missiles together because you can carry up to 20 and just come up from behind and start pounding them. And that was a moment that never lost its luster. The mines are also useful if someone's on your tail, and the lightning attack is essentially Outlaw's special from the first couple Twisted Metal games, and as such it's pretty useful in most close quarters situations. Then you have less useful weapons like Oil Slick, or worse, the Flamethrower, which is short range and only fires directly in front of you. Honestly, I've never liked flamethrowers in games. It always feels like you're just spraying them with silly string for all the impact they have. Thankfully, the character-specific specials are more varied. They even go beyond attacks that simply damage you. The first character I chose to play as, Sergeant Steele's special attack was just a nuke, which was pretty badass, but other character specials include attacks that transform you into a chicken and your weapons into eggs, things that will reverse your controls, and so on. Things that aren't fun to get hit with, but I appreciate that they're having fun with the weapon archetypes. And another thing I appreciate is the money element to this game. Aside from getting points for your round placement, you also get money, and you can find money around the levels by breaking objects and doing tricks, which makes use of this game's unique physics engine, and you can use said money to buy upgrades for your boat, like that one monster truck game I played, and I recall thinking that I would have liked this upgrade system in a game that wasn't boring, which is certainly true here. You'd probably need a side-by-side to notice the changes, but nonetheless it's something I appreciate. And it's also fun that they have dumb little useless knickknacks you can buy. It's entirely pointless, but it continues to showcase how much this game is just brimming with personality, and it really is, in pretty much every possible way. Once you've bought everything else, you can load up on weapons before the start of every round and completely wreck shit. So yeah, this is a great game, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time with it. But here's the biggest issue with Dead in the Water that I teased earlier, and I genuinely do not know what they were thinking here. You need to go through 3 seasons before you can face the final boss, which isn't necessarily a bad idea, having qualifying rounds before you get to the main event. The problem comes with how these qualifying rounds are structured. The first season is 3 levels, the second is 6, and the third is a full 8. But this game only has 8 levels outside of the final boss arena, so instead of having fully unique levels for each round, all the levels from round 1 are repeated in round 2, and in round 3, they have all the levels from round 1 and 2 repeat. Meaning that you have to play through levels 1 to 3 3 times, and levels 4 to 6 twice before you reach the main event. It just comes across as pointless padding when the game was already a decent length as it was for what it was. I mean, I'm not mad, I'm just baffled as to why anybody would think this was a necessary inclusion. So that's why, if I were on the design team, I would have insisted on cutting the racing mode and using the resources to create something like 8 new levels. 3 for the first round, 5 for the second round, and have the third round consist of the 8 existing levels. Or alternatively, don't bother with the 3-season structure and just have us play through all 8 levels and then fight the final boss like every other car combat game. I don't want to sound like I'm dogging on Dead in the Water too much because aside from this one issue, it's one of the better vehicle combat games I've ever played, and it's absolutely worth checking out if you're into the genre whatsoever. Despite padding and a slightly tacked on secondary mode, I really enjoyed this game, and you probably would too. Imagine my shock, viewer. At one point I went on record as saying that I didn't cover Motor Mayhem VCL because I heard PS2 emulation is a pain in the ass. And now having gotten into PS2 emulation, I can safely say that's a load of crap. Once you have a working PS2 BIOS file, PS2 emulation is about as plug and play as it gets. So thankfully I was able to get this game going, and my first question is this game called Motor Mayhem Vehicular Combat League, or is it Vehicular Combat League presents Motor Mayhem? I've seen both. I guess for simplicity's sake, I'll just call this game Motor Mayhem. As with most of these games, I'm jumping in blind, so as with most of these games, the first thing I do is press all the buttons to see what does what, and the first thing I notice is that as with most of these games, Motor Mayhem has no accelerate button. You accelerate by holding forward on the analog stick or D-pad, and call me Whitesnake, cause here I go again. Oh wait, they let you change it in the options menu. Score. So this game is basically presented as an intergalactic TV show with competitors from all over the universe, each with their own unique vehicles, characters, stats, and backstories, hashing it out in buffed up vehicles with ridiculous weaponry. It's a simple and familiar setup, and despite not really having much of a story beyond the framing device, it bloody works out, I think. The controls are a little bit floaty, but otherwise than that, this is a great vehicle combat game with a lot of pick up and play quality. Once I got the controls figured out, it was like slipping on an old pair of slippers as I merrily drifted around shooting like a maniac. What with the game taking on more sci-fi theming, the weapons and environments are made to match the theming, with such things as Gauss cannons and long-range lasers, giving this game a very distinct feel compared to its contemporaries. Sci-fi theming in games is always a good way to inject freshness. The sky's the limit when it comes to visual and gameplay variety in sci-fi, and they certainly take advantage of that fact here. Granted, the variety of arenas is a bit lacking. There's only a small handful of levels to fight in, but at least they're all distinct. Then aside from the game benefiting from the theming in a visual sense, the weapons are all fun to use and have a good feeling of weight behind them. I practically felt myself inadvertently pelvic thrusting whenever I got a good hit with the flat cannon. The long-ranged lasers were a joy to use once you got used to the fact that they always fire slightly to the left, They even have a mini nuke, which is rare and a bit disappointing to use. And I like the machine gun upgrades in particular. Most games will give you a single upgrade for your standard machine guns at best, but you can upgrade them upwards of 4 times here, and it becomes so satisfying to lay into people with fully upgraded machine guns. You become unstoppable at that point. Motor Mayhem also has 3 different game modes: Eliminator, Deathmatch, and Endurance. Eliminator is what it sounds like. You're put into an arena with several opponents, last man standing wins. It's your standard game mode in these games, and one that I prefer they have. Endurance is similar, but with the added twist of everyone being against you, and you have to face them in multiple waves. It's all about surviving on 1 life. Deathmatch, on the other hand, I'm not a fan of, because it's all about racking up points. And I'm not a fan of that because you can whittle someone's health down almost all the way, but if you don't get the last hit, you might as well have been drifting around in circles for all the good you did. Kill stealing is a big frustration with these games, and the only game that's gotten away with it is cell damage because most weapons kill you in 1 hit anyway. It's still not bad, just not preferable to the other 2 modes. But regardless of mode, you always find yourself in the same place in the end, fighting the final boss, Buzzsaw. He's a tough nut to crack, but just make yourself familiar with the location of the healing items and you'll do fine. If there's one general criticism I can give Motor Mayhem, the special attacks are not self-explanatory whatsoever. I saw in the controls menu that there was a special attack button, but pressing it didn't seem to do anything. It turns out you need to input button commands in conjunction with this attack button to do one of your character's attacks. The only in-game indicator of this is 2 sub-menus deep into the character select. What an idiot I am for my inability to predict that. I'm sure experts on the game are probably laughing at me, but don't forget, I picked this game up sight unseen and I'm playing it blind. I don't have the benefit of years of experience behind me, nor do I have the benefit of a manual. Still, either way, this game is a quality time that I had a lot of fun with. Critics at the time weren't impressed, but I think they were a little bit harsh. Despite wearing its influence on its sleeve and having a few hiccups here and there, I had a rollicking good time with Motor Mayhem, and I look forward to playing it at some point again. So, trying to get this game to run properly was a cavalcade of failure. Okay, so Smash and Survive was a game that I teased you with last time, but I instead opted for Vigilante 8's Second Offense, which was a good decision because that game was significantly less of a headache than this one, and I mean that in every way. Smash and Survive was a discount PSN title from the early 2010s, but come to find out, Smash and Survive is not only obscure, it was actually delisted at some point. And to my knowledge, there are no physical copies in existence, so I had no way to officially buy this. Moreover, version 2 games, which I believe was based out of India somewhere, no longer exists, and I could barely find any info about it at all. Thankfully, the game has been preserved via emulation circles, and I've recently been able to upgrade my rig to an RTX 3070, which will be old and shitty in no time, but for now it's the best rig I've ever had, meaning I can finally get into some of the more demanding sides of emulation. Unfortunately, despite claims that this game is fully compatible with RPCS3, this is what it looks like by default. I was looking for info on how to make this game look decent, but because it's so obscure, there was little to no info. I found out that switching from Vulkan to OpenGL made the screen clear except for the top left corner, which is where the main chunk of the UI is. Not that it matters, because even if that left chunk of the screen were clear, it wouldn't make this game look any less crap. This is genuinely the ugliest PS3 game I've encountered. The textures are low quality, everything looks very basic, the lighting and effects are pitiful, the environments look uninspired and low quality. This is simply an ugly game, and let me tell you, it doesn't play much better. Okay, so the idea is you smash and survive, which incidentally is exactly how my honeymoon went. It's mission-based, and you think there's going to be more variety at first because the early game has a bit of racing, a bit of collecting, and yes, a bit of smashing and surviving. But then as you get into it, almost every level turns into some sort of combat scenario. You might need to plant a bomb, destroy specific vehicles, protect your base, etc. But every mission will end once your opponents are all destroyed. So mission objectives are almost pointless at times. How does the combat work on the other hand? Well, most of it is just, smashing into each other opportunistically. So unless you're in a mission that requires speed, it's smart just to pick the available car with the highest strength stat. I got through most of the game using this car. I would also like to point out, despite some missions requiring speed, speed isn't a displayed stat. Most cars have a specific weapon, which is where generic Demolition Derby turns into Twisted Metal style game. Like, my vehicle of choice had grinders on the side, so you could grind people into a fine paste while sideswiping them. So all that accounted for, you go through mission after mission until you fight the final boss. Was this game worth all the trouble I went through to play it? No. As a matter of fact, the best way I can describe this game is slightly more functional big rigs. The controls feel like I'm playing through a marshmallow for how sticky they are, each vehicle handles like you're driving a brick, and the severe lack of vehicle damage or any sort of physical feedback while throwing your weight around makes the combat feel so wooden. It just does not feel good to play whatsoever, and I swear to God, every single time you use your weapon, it goes into this crash cam thing. Every single time. It was cool at first, but after 100 times, I really wish there was an option to turn it off. Incidentally, there's very few options in this game altogether. There's one weapon they introduced late into the game that almost made me turn the game off because it just cancels all your momentum and makes you float, making it nearly impossible to fight specific enemies. I basically managed to beat that mission by the skin of my teeth. The missions are overall boring and repetitive, the gameplay arenas are flat and uninteresting. They try and have stage hazards, but they're such a non-factor that I forgot they were even a thing for most of the time. The sound design is atrocious. Most of the game you hear the same 1 or 2 6-second chugging butt rock riffs looped until you want to stick sharpened pencils into your ears. And for whatever reason, some obstacles you run into will break the game audibly. Honestly, I was so bored, it was almost paralyzing. Nothing about this game holds my interest. The most amusing thing I found was laughing at the weird names this game came up with for the vehicles. Literally, in the hour and a half it took me to play the story mode, I felt physically sick to my stomach by the end. I had to lie down afterwards. I really appreciate the effort the developers probably put into this game, but it's bad. It feels like a fake game you'd see on an episode of Drake and Josh. But it still makes me sad that this game was almost lost to history. Once it was delisted, that could have been it had someone not bothered to preserve it. And this is the danger of an all-digital future. I like digital in concept, but if it means games ceasing to exist, then I never want physical games to go away. So, this is how you know I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel. I'm reaching for an obscure XBLA game to fill out the list. Novadrome by Stainless Games, and published by Disney of all companies. Although despite the obscurity, this does give me a chance to break out Xenia for the first time. Oh snap, it looks like I can only play the trial version. So it looks like I'm not even getting the full experience. Why must these games work against me so? Ah well, at least I can play the thing. Even if it's only for a small sampling of the overall experience. And as far as sampling goes, I can't even say this game has a sampling of story, because it's basically a non-factor in the game as it's entirely contained within a menu screen, which in my opinion is the worst way to bring across a story. Because video games are an interactive medium, so having the story via text dump goes against the benefits of interactive media, so I find my eyes glazing over as I attempt to read. Weave the narrative into gameplay, or at least give us a visual component. But I guess that's not really what they were focusing on, because it's merely a framing device to contextualize the action, and to their credit, the gameplay is decent enough. Novadrome does a very unique thing as far as points are concerned. Instead of having each player have a point tally for the game mode objective, the overall game mode objective has a limited pool. What I mean is, for example, instead of having the first player to 15 kills win, the game has it to where the round will end as soon as 15 kills take place overall. And the person with the most points in the time the round took place wins. So all players are playing from the same pool, which makes things interesting. It quickens up the pace quite a bit in that it's more of a best of rather than a first two type of game. And it had a sprinkling of intensity, knowing that at any moment a sudden series of kills can use up the entire pool while you're scrambling to try and get your piece of the pie. Although this approach does encourage kill stealing, which I've already explained how much I dislike. Novadrome has several game modes, but most of them are locked behind the paywall. The three I played were Wrecking Ball, Beacon Blast, and Hounded. Wrecking Ball is your standard deathmatch style game, the most points after X amount of kills wins. Beacon Blast is sort of a race mode where the game will have a certain amount of beacons before the game ends. You get points for reaching the beacons first, and the beacon location will be completely random, and Hounded is probably the most interesting idea. It's a tag-style game, but in reverse, where one player is it and everyone is racing to touch the player who's it so they can be it. Because only the player who's it can collect pods. You collect pods to get points, person with the most points in the end wins. The repeating theme throughout this game are those points, and it works when those points are won and lost based on the exact same thing. However, it doesn't work when you can earn points for one thing and lose them for another reason. For example, in the Beacon Blast game mode where you get a certain amount of points for every beacon you get, you can also have your points stolen by getting killed. And I found the easiest way to play this game is just to let everyone else do all the work getting the beacons and then lay into them stealing their points. It's not a guaranteed win, but it's the most reliable way to play the mode considering the beacon's location will be entirely random. So otherwise, it's based around being lucky enough to have the beacon spawn near you and not some other player. Which is frustrating, so at least they do include a plan B. The same also applies for the Hounded minigame. This game is definitely based around combat first and everything else second, and the combat could be better. The reticle automatically locks onto whoever's the nearest enemy in your sights, making targeting specific enemies kind of hard, and your reticle is massive, making it nearly impossible to not always have someone in your sights, which can be a bit frustrating when it automatically targets one of the minor enemies and not one of the other players. And once you've started attacking, it will continue to lock onto that enemy until they're dead, they leave your sights, or you stop attacking, meaning you'll never have any trouble laying into enemies. Granted, this trial only had one of the 6 available weapons, so I'm sure that playing the full version of this game would at least add a little bit more combat variety, but the fact that they have a weapon like this in the game at all is questionable. There is still some fun to be had here. The sci-fi setting is fun and colorful, the various launch pads adds a little bit of strategic depth to the gameplay both offensively and defensively, the physics are arcadey and fun, the driving is smooth, you got stage hazards, various pickups, and so on. There is a neat little game in here somewhere that I wasn't able to fully experience, but what I did experience didn't blow my balls off, but it kept me entertained enough. I would have never given this game a second look had it not fit into a themed video, but I'm glad I did check it out. Granted, I did play this game for the least amount of time of any game on this entire list, but that had more to do with the lack of content within the trial rather than anything this game did. Blood Drive was another game that was recommended to me by the good people of the comment section, and let me just tell you, my first attempt to play this game was a f***ing disaster. My first thought was RPCS 3, but this was what it looked like. The texture f***ups are bad enough, but there's literally no collision. I fell out of the map within a minute. So I was about to write this one off before remembering emulation is taken on a case-by-case basis, so I thought it worth it to check out the Xbox 360 version on Xenia. And you know what? It works like a charm there. Oh wait, no, it crashed. It crashed again. It crashed again. Oh my god, this is actually a problem. I might not be able to cover this game. I can't get through a single event without something messing up. I'm not sure what else to do. Well, there is one thing. I was made aware of a different version of Xenia called Xenia Canary. Specifically, it's for beta testing builds before they get an official release. So this right here is my Hail Mary. It works. It goddamn works! Hallelujah! Xenia Canary with the clutch! This is a genuine miracle, and I am ecstatic! Emulation really is more art than science. Although I can still tell there's some compatibility issues because sometimes I hit this glitch where everyone's wheels sink into the ground, and at one point collision stopped working altogether. But it works 85 to 90% of the time. Okay, Blood Drive is basically like if you took the Terror is Reality TV show from Dead Rising 2 and made an entire game out of it. And despite that game possibly being my favorite Capcom game ever made, Terror is Reality had very little to do with that. To those unfamiliar, Terror is Reality was a fictional TV show in Dead Rising 2 where various drivers would compete in competitions mostly centered around killing large numbers of zombies in souped-up vehicles. And that is Blood Drive in a nutshell. It's presented like a post-apocalyptic reality TV show, and the setup really allows this game's personality to shine, especially with the pre-level interviews and the over-the-top announcer.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the city of Las Ruletas, your host for the Blood Drive Tournament!
Otherwise, it's another familiar setup. Various characters with different cars, various weapons, special attacks, everything you expect. But with the added twist of zombies, because this was 2010 when the entire video game industry collectively decided that zombies needed to be in every single game. I lived through that. It frustrated me back then, and to this day it's probably why I still roll my eyes at anything zombie related. We kind of take it for granted, but it's weird to think that media in general decided for a hot minute that this specific brand of monster was just the in thing. Just take a step back and think about how weirdly arbitrary that is. But anyways, Twisted Metal X Zombies, I'm down with that. With the addition of zombies, you have the addition of game modes that involve killing zombies, and I must say, there's something so zen about running down hundreds of the dead bastards. Being post-apocalyptic in a more urban setting, you get your pick of various dilapidated environments, including a smelting plant, a parking lot, or an airport. Incidentally, they call the airport level Flightmare, but they missed a real opportunity not calling it Death Row Airport. The locations aren't the most interesting, and the graphics aren't exactly mind-blowing considering this was during an era of grey-brown everything. Aside from the zombies, this game has a few other ideas up its sleeve, such as the rival mechanic. This game will randomly assign you a rival, and you will be awarded a bonus point if you place higher than them in the round. And I appreciate that, to my knowledge, for every combination of rival, they have a unique pre-round interview.
Jackson, have you got any words for your rival?
I'll tell you once, and I'll tell you only once, Bedlam. This tournament's about car combat and zombie killing, nothing else. No stupid music, no trying to get your band back together, and no weak-ass crap like you've been laying all over the track. Are we clear?
It's a fun idea that adds a little bit of spice without getting in the way. Then you also have the different buffs you can choose from. They have a wide variety, but personally, I chose Rampage most of the time because it has you start off with Maximum Rage, which is your special meter. And my main was Jackson, who has a shockwave attack similar to Axel in Twisted Metal, which absolutely dominated in large hordes. But I also occasionally chose the tank buff simply for the double ammo option. But there are plenty of options here to choose from in order to optimize your playstyle. The main mode involves playing through these tournaments, and you get points depending on where you place at the end of the level, with each tournament having more locations and more rounds to play through as the game goes on. Otherwise, the controls are a little bit heavier than other games in the genre, but they still feel responsive. The weapons are fairly standard, with the exception of things like the saw blade, but otherwise they're fun to use. And there's enough spectacle and weight to the combat that it keeps me interested. Thankfully, with this being one of the only HD games on the list, it takes advantage of that with plenty of flashy effects, which adds to the id-tickling nature of the gameplay, and the zombies create a bit of stimulating gameplay spectacle that acts as the spackle between the more interesting parts of the game, even if you're playing a mode that doesn't involve killing zombies. There are multiple types of zombies, but none of them are really of that much consequence. Because these zombies are so brittle, the game modes that involve killing zombies are fun because you're racking up points so quickly, and stealing points is almost impossible. Unlike the modes where you get points for destroying other cars, in which case the kill stealing can be a bit frustrating like any number of these games. Meanwhile, the King of the Skull mode where you have to hold onto the skull for as long as you can is also a bit frustrating because it's so chaotic trying to leave a scrum with the skull that it's basically just luck. It's all about who rams who last, so the skull can change hands a dozen times in any given pileup. But those are all relative nitpicks, and the overall experience is fairly solid. But if everything about this game is basically good, then why am I still feeling kind of about it overall? Well, as fun as this game is on a core level, it really shoots itself in the foot with repetition. There's 7 game modes and 6 levels. Not a bad amount for what this game is. And the first couple of tournaments aren't too bad. You start out by playing 3 events in 1 level, then 6 events split between 2 levels, but by the 3rd cup, you have to play 10 events between 3 levels. By the time you've gotten to this point, you've already played the majority of level and game mode combinations. But this game goes up to, no joke, 30 events between 6 different levels in a single tournament. That is ridiculous. I thought Dead in the Water was bad for making you repeat certain levels once or twice, but this exponential crap is unforgivable. The fact that they pack so much repetition into this game just to get to the end. And imagine if you don't win. What if you get near the end to the 30-round tournament and have a few bad levels and fall behind? Imagine how much time you just wasted. By about 2 hours worth of tournaments and a little bit of fiddling around with the challenge mode, I felt that I'd already seen everything there was to see. Honestly, if I were in charge, here's what I would have done. So let's see, you have 6 levels and 7 game modes, which is a total of 42 unique combinations, which means you have 5¼ unique combinations per character. So how about instead of having the tournaments be the exact same regardless of character you choose, you scrap that idea and give each character their own unique combination of levels for an arcade tournament mode. Let's say you give them 6 or 7 levels. That way, every character can have a mostly unique combination of levels and game modes. And then after that, you give them a unique character ending. I appreciate that they attempted something new here, but the repetition is so egregious that I really wish they would have just done the standard thing for the genre. There is absolutely a solid foundation here, and with a little bit of tweaking, this could have been a great game, but even solid gameplay can be ruined by subpar execution and progression. See Just Cause 4 for that particular crash course. While I don't think this game is nearly as bad as critics at the time would have you believe, it definitely could have been a lot better. It's an example of a game that's fun to play but not fun to beat. So that's how I would recommend it. Boot it up for a couple hours and never think about it again after that. So, when I decided to make this video, I didn't quite have enough games to fill out the list, at least of those I had yet to cover. So I decided to do a little bit of a deep dive into the Wikipedia article for car combat games, and go game by game to decide which of them fit the bill enough for me to put on the list, which led me to Bandits Phoenix Rising, a PC game from 2002. But I kind of overlooked the fact that by going into these games based on first impressions alone, that some of these games might be abandonware. That is to say, games that are no longer legally sold. So your only recourse is to acquire them illegally. That was true with this game, which is unfortunate because abandonware always carries the risk of simply not being compatible with modern systems. The last compatibility test that I saw with this game is on Windows 8, and I'm currently stuck with Windows 11. This is irritating because I don't mind supporting the official release, and when you buy from a storefront, there's at least a reasonable expectation that it'll work, but you don't have that guarantee with abandonware. So this was my first foray into retro PC gaming in a hot minute, and it's completely compatible with modern Windows. Color me shocked. Once you install the 1.1.1 patch, it works like a dream. Even lets you set the resolution to 1080p widescreen. That's completely unlike any previous retro PC gaming experience I've had. I remember trying to play Disney's Math Quest with Aladdin, and I had to hard reset my computer for all the issues that game caused. Now, why was I playing that game? 1, nostalgia, and 2, it had a surprisingly dark story for an edutainment game. As for Bandits Phoenix Rising, and I hate that neither of those titles are distinctive enough that I could call the game one or the other, this is a mission-based car combat game, and evidently one that's so obscure that not a single walkthrough that I could find or complete long play exists, and the Wikipedia article has almost no details. Though it was made by Grin, who is probably most well known for 2 separate Bionic Commando reboots, the latter of which had one of the dumbest plot twists I've ever seen. So, the story is, it's the apocalypse again, and the post-apocalyptic wasteland has various roaming gangs of murderers fighting for territory. Meanwhile, you take control of 2 bandits, Rudolph, spelt in a very weird way, and Fennec, as they try to survive and make big money in the wasteland, all while avoiding factions like the Flaming Pumpkins or the Enclave, and making allies of other factions they see as worthy of their services. Which gets them caught up in various conflicts. Gradually we learn that there's a conspiracy to where certain factions are teaming up against you, and also there's a girl that appears apropos of nothing. And what does it all lead to? I wouldn't know, I didn't finish the game. More on that in a minute. I like the dynamic between Rudolph and Fennec. They had a good banter going, and Rudolph is the most Scottish man to ever exist, which only makes the banter that much more fun.
Oh yeah? Remember the time when we raided the chicken truck and it turned out that the driver had...
Shut up, you're giving us away!
The voice acting is fairly solid on the main characters, although the side characters range from decent to awful.
Your combat skills exceeded my expectations by far.
And I really like how every time you kill an enemy, there's a chance that they'll monologue for a second before blowing up. It always makes for a good laugh.
I'm dead. Oh, here I come.
Especially the faction of characters that sounds like Dr. Orpheus from Venture Brothers.
I face death without fear! Pizza rolls!
So this is a game that just oozes personality. Ironically though, this game lacks drive, because I spent my entire time playing this game wondering where the hell it was all going because a key driving force in the plot never presented itself. It was just a bunch of people doing stuff with no larger goal, so I found myself having a hard time getting fully invested in the plot when I don't know where we're all going with this. As far as gameplay is concerned, it starts out pretty simple. You're in a dune buggy with a gun, figure it out. The controls are fantastic. It's a standard mouse and keyboard setup, and I'm a sucker for the precision that the mouse gives you while shooting. Then the driving is very smooth and arcadey, but still has enough weight that it feels satisfying to drive. By default, your car automatically prioritizes steering towards where the reticle is facing, which I appreciate because it means that you're never blindsided by anything out of your view. But you can toggle this off by pressing tab. The weapons you get don't start too exciting. A standard machine gun, a shotgun, a grenade launcher that launches at 3 different altitudes, which I never used, because if I ask for anything in my games, it's consistency. That said, after a while, you get a number of different weapons to use, and a number of different cars, each of which subtly add variety, and as the game goes on, you get a wider variety of enemies to fight. The thing about the secondary weapons is they can't be aimed, you can only fire them directly in front of you to my knowledge, and for some reason, even when fired directly at an enemy, the rockets have a habit of completely missing the target. So I found that the only consistently useful secondary weapon was the shotgun, because if you can get a direct hit up close, it's devastating. The shredder is also pretty useful. Either way, the combat packs a punch, and there's a lot of it, and the combat is punctuated by a fantastic soundtrack. Some of the tracks are fairly lame, but when they get into those sweet guitar licks, it's my exact brand of butt rock. So I found the game to be enjoyable to a point, but the writing on the wall starts to become legible when only a short way into the game you're expected to do an escort quest. Then suddenly half the levels are escort quests, and the other half you have an NPC ally who you need to keep alive. For a while, they're fairly inoffensive, although one of them I had to redo a couple of times because in one case I forgot to disable a couple of turrets before clearing the way for the convoy, and the second time my game just straight up crashed, but it's not too bad. And the game is actually fairly reasonable for most of it. But then you get to level 13, aptly called Choo Choo, where you have to escort a train to the other side of the map. Problem being though, all the convoys you needed to escort up to this point stayed put until you cleared the way for them. Not in this case. The train rolled on whether you liked it or not, and under direct fire, the train has a life expectancy of a swarm of locusts once the flamethrowers are brought out. So your only option is to bum rush the enemy, but there are so many, so putting yourself in the line of fire is suicide. Plus, the level is unforgivably long for what it is. Even with my most armored vehicle, the devastating cannon in place of my standard machine gun, and exploring the level for all the health I could get in what time I had, I got taken apart over and over. It's not so much a difficulty spike as much as it is a difficulty wall, and after about 7 or 8 attempts, I decided to cut my losses. This was the 13th level, and if the game files are anything to go off of, there are 22 levels, but I feel as though I'd seen all the game had to offer, and while exploring the game files, I found that the game's ending was readily accessible as an AVI file. Well, endings, as it looks like there's a good ending and a bad ending, neither of which are particularly impressive. I won't spoil it, but this game is fairly easy to get a hold of, so if you care to see the whole thing for yourself, feel free, but if the plot had any developments past level 13, the endings give no indication of that, minus one minor plot element. I still think this game is a quality time. The combat's good, the world is well realized, the driving physics are exactly what I look for in this type of game. If it just cut down or cut out the escort quests, I would feel a lot more keen to go back to it. Still, to me, this comes across as a game that has all the makings of a cult classic, and I do see myself coming back to it every now and again, especially because it's technically free. Now, I'm sure there's some PlayStation platformer fans who are disappointed that this isn't a Crash Bandicoot spin-off. Crashday was one game that I came across while scouring the Wikipedia article for games that would fit this list. But of course, this is also an old PC game, which meant I was playing with fire once again. That is until I realized this game actually had a Steam re-release in 2017 called Crashday Redline Edition. Thank you, Lord Jesus Christ, I don't have to go the abandonware route again. Crashday is a big game compared to some of the other games I've covered. It has no less than 7 different game modes, and several more sub-game modes. Unfortunately, I may have made a mistake, because only one of these modes actually involves car combat in any way. Lots of racing, and even in modes where you don't race, there's still quite a few racing elements, like the bomb run where you have to stay above a certain speed, or the bomb that's strapped to you will explode, and the more checkpoints you drive through, the higher the necessary base speed will be. Of course, as I said, there is a combat mode, aka Wrecking Match, which thankfully has 3 different sub-modes: Deathmatch, aka Points to Win, Deathmatch with Teams, and Last Man Standing. So you get your pick of the litter as far as what you prefer the winning conditions be. Unfortunately, you only have 2 different weapons, those being the minigun and the missiles. Otherwise, ramming is your only other offensive option. So the variety is lacking, and as a result it feels a little bit static. There's little escalation or alteration. You play one match, you've played them all. It certainly could be worse, but it kind of furthers this overall gut feeling I have. More on that in a moment. But also I feel like because the rest of the game tries to be so grounded and realistic, the fact that there's a mode with all this crazy stuff going on feels a bit tonally incongruous. It's like adding a rhythm section to Max Payne. You know, like press X in time with the beat to mourn your dead wife. But it's still a quality time for what it is. The controls are definitely more optimized for straight up racing, so you can expect the controls to be a lot heavier than what you'd expect, but it works fine for what it is. The gameplay is otherwise fast-paced, and you can die in a second, but the fast pace keeps the game exciting, as well as keeps you on your toes. You have many vehicles, all with their own stats, and as you go through the game you can earn money for new vehicles as well as upgrades for said vehicles in order to optimize them for specific game modes. Crashday kind of feels like the opposite of Dead in the Water. Where that game felt like a vehicle combat game with a racing mode tacked on, this feels like a racing game with a vehicle combat mode tacked on. I think there's a case to be made that this game tries to do too much. I believe that you can perfectly optimize gameplay and controls to do one thing truly great, but rarely more. Crashday is a solid, realistic racer. However, the combat mode feels slightly tacked on. It doesn't have the depth of mechanics necessary because it clearly wasn't the main focus. But I think the gameplay mode that gets the wooden spoon is stunt mode. The controls just aren't optimized for this type of thing whatsoever, and you have very little control over what you can do in the air. Unless I am an absolute dumbass and missed something important. The best you can do is ramp off whatever you see and hope for the best, so whether you win or lose kind of felt random because you have very little control over how you get points. And the general philosophy behind this game's design becomes apparent in the career mode, when you notice that 85% of the missions are some sort of race, but it really gives you the wrong first impression, considering the first thing the game has you do is a round of crazy car combat and then settles into its racing groove. I think this game is to Twisted Metal what Darksiders is to God of War. Something that probably took a bit of inspiration but is definitely its own thing, to the point where it probably doesn't belong on this list. And for what Crashday is, it's pretty good, but it's unfortunately not really my thing. It's a little bit too dry for me, a little bit too grounded. It's not something that really interests me because I find the realism in its world and design gives this game an overall lack of personality. Throughout all this, there was a story going on in the background, but honestly, off the top of my head, I could not tell you a single thing about it. I know for a fact that this game is a cult classic and it has its fan base, so I know that everything I said is probably complete sacrilege to some, but keep in mind I'm not saying this game is bad, not one iota. It's well designed, the controls are solid, the gameplay is good for what it is, it's just not my thing. And I think we'd all do better in life if we were able to admit that certain things just aren't made for us. Like those people who still complain about Teen Titans Go to this day. And who am I to hone in on this game complaining that it's not what I thought it should be? It is what it is, and if you like that sort of thing, then you'll like Crashday. And now the big one. Interstate 76 was a massive request from last time, because Vigilante 8 and Vigilante 8 Second Offense were spin-offs of this game. Something I wouldn't have known considering before my previous Knockoffs video, I'd never even heard of Vigilante 8, so I'd further never heard of Interstate 76. Especially because both Vigilante 8 games were made by Luxaflux and Interstate 76 was an in-house production by Activision. So here we are with the evolutionary ancestor to one of the better car combat games ever made. Is this one just as good? Well, we'll see about that. First of all, I ran into some problems, because even the good old games version of Interstate 76 had some issues running this game above a certain frame rate. And the entire mission statement of good old games is to get retro games working on modern systems. I didn't even realize this until about 2 hours of trying to play the 5th mission when I just couldn't seemingly make a jump. And limiting the frame rate didn't seem to work, neither in the NVIDIA Inspector nor the NVIDIA control panel. No matter what I did, the game refused to stop running at 60 FPS. I managed to find a 25 FPS patch, but then that patch would randomly crash when entering new levels or cutscenes. I think it has something to do with the resolution change. Either way, it was a nightmare trying to get through this game. It kind of became a curse for a day or two, and honestly kinda killed a lot of the enjoyment I was having. Interstate 76 was doing everything it could to make me not enjoy it, and I guess it kind of succeeded, which is a shame because this game is really solid. My first impression of this game is that Interstate 76 is kind of, well, very basic visually. even for 1997. Everything was just a collection of textureless polygons, which means one of two things. Either this game was a budget title, or they were prioritizing scale over visual fidelity. Well, I'm pleased to say that it's the latter. Interstate 76 is huge, and it has a whole-ass linear story mode filled with charm and personality. I've heard this game described as the funkiest game you'll ever come across, and I don't disagree. I can't think of any other game that truly encapsulates that disco feel quite like this. Set in an alternative 1970s where the 1973 oil crisis was never resolved, law and order has broken down, leading to various private citizens to take up vigilantism to try and keep the peace. And the story centers around a duo of vigilantes, Taurus, aka Stampede, and Groove, aka Swinger, as they investigate a murder of a fellow vigilante and sister of Groove named Jade, which leads them down a rabbit hole where they discover a sinister conspiracy by OPEC to nuke America's largest oil reserve in order to perpetuate the crisis and keep prices high, which is carried out by a man named Antonio Malocchio, who also killed Jade when she got too close to the truth. It's an epic story considering what these games usually have, and I enjoy that it has a sense of humor about itself that keeps things light even though the subject matter is theoretically pretty heavy. Although I'm not sure if the sense of humor was intended or if that was just the 1970s disco aesthetic making everything slightly absurd. Either way, this game is just brimming with personality, and I really appreciate it for that. Meanwhile, once you map the controls how you like them and get used to them, this is a really solid car combat game. It is, however, one that you can't play idly, because you need to be listening to the dialogue in order to know exactly what you need to do and where you need to go. It's very easy to miss a key bit of dialogue and get lost. And when I said this game was huge, I'm not kidding. It feels like they mapped out the entire Midwest for every level, which wasn't necessary but adds to this feeling of realism to the game despite the incredibly basic look. However, that does mean you have to generally navigate by yourself. The game doesn't have a minimap or any real way to let you know where to go other than a vague map that only serves to give you a basic outlook on the area. But I kinda like that. It means you have to intuit things based on landmarks, which makes it all the sweeter when you figure out where you're going. But the levels are still intuitively laid out, and they do always make sure to keep easy visual checkpoints around to keep navigation fair but challenging. The sheer scale does mean that some of these levels take a while, which can be frustrating if you have to replay them. But I only bring that up because the intro to level 5 will be replaying in my nightmares forevermore thanks to that almost impossible jump. Once the game is running stably, you probably don't need to worry about that. And the gameplay design has a surprising amount of depth. As you go through, various parts of your car will be damaged, and that will alter gameplay. Your weapons might be damaged, your tires might be popped, your engine will start running slower. Things that are a bit mundane these days, but back in 1997 that was straight up groundbreaking, and I really appreciate that all the HUD elements exist within your car and you can look around to check them. Although that probably loses something if you switch to the third-person camera. As you go through each level, you'll find new pieces of scrap to customize your car, including special weapons, so you can create a custom kit that operates to your specific liking. You also need to look out for repairing specific pieces to keep your car running smoothly and optimally. You could be caught in a situation where every item you have is damaged, forcing you to go into a mission with a damaged build. But you'd have to be pretty inept to have that happen because they let you repair a surprising amount between levels. Either way, this system of car health and all these individual pieces together generally gives Interstate 76 a level of immersive depth that I don't think I've ever seen in another game in the car combat genre. It's very impressive. To be honest, this game is in an entirely different league to Twisted Metal. Had it not been requested, I would have never dreamed of comparing the two beyond the fact that they both include car combat. But here we are. How's the combat then? Yeah, it's pretty good. Despite the depth of design, the actual moment-to-moment gameplay is deceptively simple. It's mostly just maneuvering around your various adversaries and striking to best damage their vehicle. Enemies also have locational damage like you, which means that instead of just pouring damage into a vehicle, you need to target one specific part in order to completely destroy them. If you load 100% damage into their front, they'll explode, but 50 in the back, 50 in the front, they'll be running sluggish, but they'll still be good to go. And ammo is limited, so you need to be careful with that, which adds a tinge of strategy to the gameplay that separates it from your average car combat game. And throughout certain levels, you may be called upon to do other things, such as race, do a couple of stunts, or just run for your life. But every level does thankfully contain at least some car combat, so you never forget exactly where Interstate 76 hangs its hat. The driving physics are good, the handbrake turns are a bit slippery, but the driving is otherwise pretty tight. And while the machine gun feels a bit weak, the missiles have a really solid weight and feel to them, making them my universal go-to. So overall, I think this game is at its core very enjoyable, with an unprecedented amount of gameplay depth, and I really appreciate it for that. Complicated as it may have been to get my head around at first, it's an enjoyable time. It's just unfortunate that Interstate 76 did everything it possibly could to make me not enjoy it. I'm no expert in PC gaming, especially retro PC gaming, so when I went digging to try and find solutions to my issues and nothing seemed to work, even going into the NVIDIA control panel, well, I just decided to play with the cards I was dealt, and eventually it just got too frustrating for me. I had one crash too many and decided that, you know what, my patience can only be worn so thin. Even the greatest games can't stand up against 30 crashes. Still, removing all of that, Interstate 76 is a quality time. Just be prepared for some struggles if you want to hop in. And that was that. And if I may speak off the record for a moment, holy shit! Mask off for a moment. I bit off way more than I could chew with this one. Having been trying to do weekly videos from September to the end of the year, I vastly underestimated how much work that would be, especially for videos like this. This wouldn't have been difficult had I not also been working on like 5 other videos at the same time, and needed this video out at a specific time, so this one was a tough nut to crack. And I guess the me that's currently speaking doesn't know if this video made it out in time for its scheduled release. Hey future me, did we make it? If there's one thing that characterizes me, it's my relentless stubbornness. If I commit to something, I commit to it. Overall, if I were to rank the games I've covered today, I'd say Dead in the Water is probably top of the pile, followed by Motor Mayhem, then Battletanx, Interstate 76 after that, but it would have been better if not for all the issues I ran into. Crashday would go right in the middle of the pile. Then I put Bandits Phoenix Rising, with the caveat that it's a good game with questionable difficulty progression. Then Blood Drive after that, then Battletanx Global Assault. In second to last place I put Novadrome, but that comes with a massive caveat. And then far, far below that I would put Smash and Survive. Because it's not every day that I get to cover a game that's a borderline bootleg. So I hope you enjoyed this little dive into the world of car combat. Both games that clearly took inspiration from Twisted Metal, and games that were really only put on the list to fill space. And if there was one thing this little charade has taught me, it's to stop bothering with retro PC gaming. I don't think there are enough similar games to make a part 3, but if there is, I'd be more than happy to oblige. And if you like what I do here on Tactical Bacon Productions, please consider supporting me on Patreon for unique perks and rewards like these fine people on screen. And a special thanks to users Inutsu and Raf for going above and beyond. And if you want to support my channel for free, be sure to like this video, subscribe, hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing, and let me know what you think in the comment section below. Otherwise, I've been the King of Snark Style, and I will see you next time. Peace!